arts, lifestyle. SNS Online.
If you could touch the alien sand and hear the cries of strange birds and watch them wheel in another sky, would that satisfy you?
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as king and emperor. And now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. This I do with all my heart.
The Copacabana proudly presents Lola Lamar and Tony Starr.
He reads the news practically 365 days in the year.
Is that interesting? Must be very interesting. I mean, it must keep you very well informed.
No, I don't know about that. I know very little about a lot of things.
We have always fought for men and for our children. Now, we are prepared to fight for our own human rights and freedom.
Can I tell you something?
What?
I can't tell anyone else.
Then don't. If you have a secret, you must never tell it, except to an enemy. If you tell your best friend, inevitably the whole world will find out.
I used to be afraid of you, Livanus, but not anymore. I am richer than you are, and I have never been this happy in my life. If I want to, I can break your back.
Hello and welcome to SNS Online. Today's special guest is an accomplished film, television and theatre director who has enjoyed incredible success on both sides of a pond. From helping to put Doctor Who on the map to directing dance numbers with Barry Manilow, he continues to this day to make his mark in a wide body of work, traversing many genres, filmed all around the world and featuring a host of familiar faces such as Anthony Hopkins, Shirley MacLaine, Joan Plowright, Elizabeth Taylor and Julie Walters, to name but a few. And on his travels he has managed to collect both an Emmy and Bafta alongside a host of other accolades. Welcome, one and all, to one of the true masters of the visual medium, Mr. Waris Hussein. Welcome to the show, Waris. I have to say it's an extraordinary honour for me to get to chat to you like this, and I would very much put you in the iconic categories. A Bafta for Edward and Mrs Simpson, an Emmy for Copacabana, amongst a dazzling array of other TV and film directorial masterpieces, including Shoulder to Shoulder and Intimate Contact. And it must be flagged up, Doctor Who's very first ever director back in 1963. Be still my beating hearts, as they say. A very satisfying career to date, I would have thought.
Well, you know, it's very interesting. Your Doctor Who seems to be the flag stone for my life. I'm saying that rather in a rather amusing way because I have to acknowledge the fact that it actually was the jumping off point for my career, and that for that I'm eternally grateful.
Sure.
But I do want to emphasize that I've done so many things since, and it's very difficult because, you know, once you've accomplished what you set out to do, you move on. But I'm acutely conscious of the fact that unless you're in the public eye all the time, people tend to forget what you've done in between.
Yes.
And that sits rather heavily on me as I observe time passing and I see people coming into my orbit and then exiting, and also the fact that in some ways what I am proud of is that I was the very first British Asian director doing what I do.
Absolutely.
And did. Since then, of course, inevitably others have come forward. But it's a question of acknowledgement, I suppose. And I'm always grateful for people finding me.
Oh.
And I'm not a publicity seeker. I'm a very private person, and I like to lead my life in a quiet way. But of course, it's always nice to be acknowledged for what I've done. And the best part of all this was that a couple of years ago, the National Film Theatre was honoured by the BFI, or I was honoured by a whole month of my work.
Yes. Quite right too.
Well, thank you for that, but it spanned my television career. Obviously, they had to be selective. They couldn't choose everything I'd ever done. And the interesting thing is I'd actually forgotten what I'd done and how many things I'd done until somebody did they did a research on my work, and they called me up and said, "Did you realize you've done more than 70 or so BBC productions plus other things?" Well, other things, of course, incorporate not just the BBC, but my ITV work, and then I crossed the Atlantic and I went off to America. So it was all incorporated into this additional material. And to be honest with you, I can't remember how I did all those things within the time frame that I was working. So at this stage, when one is sitting back and looking at one's work and into the past, I'm kind of astonished myself.
Yes.
And it's sort of rewarding, but also rather worrying. Because quite honestly, I'm one of these people who never gives up. And I'm actually working on a couple of more projects now. But, time goes on. And I hope that my past work will stand for itself and give me a future.
Let's roll back to those early years to talk about your origins. Born in Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh, in, as it was at the time, part of colonial British India, your father, Ali, eventually being appointed to the Indian High Commission, and your mother, who was the highly respected author, journalist, poet, broadcaster and actor, Atiya Hussein. What was it like being brought up by someone so celebrated, and was it a case of the apple not falling far from the tree when it came to influencing your own career?
Well, yes, it's an interesting background because we actually, as a family, came to England into post-war Britain when things were pretty dark, and England and Britain in general was emerging from the war. So from what I consider a very sunny, privileged background in India, even though it was threatened by war over there too, by the way, the Japanese were advancing. However, that didn't seem to touch the subcontinent as such. And so when we got here, I, as a child, was in wonderment at seeing England, which was the mother country to what I'd been brought up in. And England was the focus of our lives, and English was my first language, actually. I was brought up by nannies, English women, a formidable lady called Mrs. Leslie. And so when I got here, what astonished me was seeing so many fair-skinned people labouring around Tilbury docks, where the ship that brought us, the HMS Strathmore, had berthed in Tilbury, and I saw people fetching and carrying, and they were all white. Well, that was very amazing for me because in India, the white people did not fetch and carry. It was us Indians.
Yes.
So that was the background to my life. But going back to my mother, I am very, very, very privileged to have been a part of her life. She was an extraordinary woman. She was also very beautiful. Now, here's the problem. I know most children say their mothers are beautiful, but in this case it was true. She was a legend in her own time in India. There was always a sort of saying that people, when they came to India, should see two things. One was the Taj Mahal, and the other was Atiya. Well, she never took it to heart. She always thought this actually somewhat of a burden, because, when you look like that, you're not supposed to have any brains, and you're not supposed to be very intelligent, but actually she came top of her class in her college. She qualified to go to Cambridge, but wasn't allowed to go because she was a woman.
Oh, that's awful.
Her eldest brother was sent off to Cambridge, but she wasn't able to do that. Anyway, she published a novel while she was here, and it was taken up by Chatto and Windus, and her editor was Cecil Day Lewis. And through him, she met the elite of the literary world in those days. So it was wonderful to be able to acknowledge this.
And I wrote this book and was dissatisfied with it. But I handed it in to the agent. And she was delighted and said that the person who was editing it and looking after it was Cecil Day Lewis. Well, I mean, I couldn't have dreamt of such a thing happening. I, who had read his poems and been, as I told you, that girl in my school, I enjoyed finding the core of an idea and finding that a sentence does not need so many words and a thought does not need that. And I did that. And it was published.
Unfortunately, she did not pursue her writing, which she should have. There were many reasons for this, but she also published a book of short stories, and I might say that right now, as we speak, Virago Press are going to republish her books again.
That's wonderful.
And that is for the future, as soon as this pandemic ends.
That's
wonderful. I'm very proud of that.
I remember the days that have gone. The springtime's garden filled with our gaiety like birdsong. I, too, could remember tables flowered with friends who have vanished like invisible writing. Where are they?
And I also would add very quickly, Vikram Seth, who wrote, as you know, A Suitable Boy, whose book was just serialized for BBC television, acknowledged the fact that he was heavily influenced by my mother's novel. So I would say that was something.
That is quite a compliment. And of course, she also worked for the BBC's Eastern Service, part of the Welsh Service, and you were involved as well. It's quite a family concern.
Yes, I learned to be at ease in front of microphones, watching my mother go to the BBC on a regular basis to Bush House, which in those days used to broadcast to both the Far East, India and Pakistan. And my mother was very fluent in both Urdu and Hindi, and even took part in Shakespeare plays translated.
Oh, it sounds like she was a wonderful woman. Were your parents religious at all?
We were born into the Muslim faith, but I would say we're secular Muslims. We did not practice on a regular basis. We did not pray 5 times a day, though my mother was very much a Muslim at heart. She was very sensitive to this, and I take care to be respectful too, but I wouldn't say that I am, because my schooling, I was put into English schools. I went to private school, prep school, public school, university. I went to Cambridge. All of that added to my thinking on what kind of religion I belonged to. At Clifton, where I was at school in Bristol, we actually had a house for Jewish boys who on Saturdays would not attend because of their Saturday observance of their own religion. But I was in the minority, being, I think, the only Muslim boy, and I used to go to chapel, and I wondered what that was all about, because we used to turn to the altar and say, I believe in God, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And I said to my mother, well, what am I supposed to say here? And she was very wise. She said, turn to the altar, say, I believe in God the Father, and then shut up. So that's what I did. I also had a very good voice before it broke, and I was in the school choir. So if you were to ask me today about hymns, I could actually sing you a hymn straight away, and I still remember the words. So that's where my religion is. I now realize that I am basically multi-religious.
Okay.
That's how I call myself.
But, as I would say, I was born into the Muslim faith, and I have a lot of strong feelings about that. And I wish I could impart that to those who don't understand.
You studied English literature at Cambridge, where you got heavily involved in theatre with some very significant contemporaries, including Ian McKellen, Trevor Nunn, Derek Jacobi, Margaret Drabble, and more. Pretty formative years, I'm presuming.
Yes. I was very privileged, and I went at a time when Cambridge was quite golden, in my opinion. It was in a sort of bubble, because before me, the sort of generation before me were Peter Hall and Jonathan Miller,
yes,
and Frederick Raphael, who then wrote The Glittering Prizes, which I ended up directing. And of course that was totally to do with Cambridge at a time when Freddie Raphael was there before me. But I understood the texture, and through his writing was able to direct with total knowledge of what I was dealing with. So basically at Cambridge, what I was saying is Cambridge was a bubble at that time in terms of the kind of people who were there. And I know that other people followed our lot, but the group that I was with ended up in very eminent theatre pieces as well as in the literature world.
BBC One.
Five seconds. Stand by 2. Stand by the caption scanner. Stand by to Q Richard. Superimpose. Mix through. Q on 2.
Good evening. Within the last few minutes, we've heard that the Russians have launched...
Now for viewers in London and the South East.
Central control to regional studios and switching centres for tonight's regional news opt-outs. Stand by, please.
This is the BBC television service. We now present another programme in our series of experimental transmissions in colour.
Switch out regions, switch out, and cut.
Let's take it back to when you joined the BBC in 1960 to train as a director. I think that was the same year Television Centre officially opened. Do you remember the interview?
My interview at the BBC, yes. Well, here's the thing. First of all, I ought to say how I got my interview, because basically they had been aware of my work at Cambridge as a student. And I had done a production of a Shaw's Caesar and Cleopatra, a student production between the Marlowe Society and the final year students at RADA, which is the first time that two groups, totally disparate groups, had been brought together. And it was my idea, and I took it to George Rylands, who was my tutor at King's College, Cambridge. And I said to him, George, can we do something about this during the summer Easter vacations? And he actually made it possible, and it played at the Arts Theatre at Cambridge for a week and got very good reviews. As a result of it, the head of drama at the BBC requested 2 tickets to come and see the production. Anyway, this is a prelude to my telling you that as a result of this, I filtered my way after various interviews with the BBC, who gave me a choice of either going to the Eastern Broadcasting Service with Bush House, which had been Sound Radio.
You're tuned to the General Overseas Service of the BBC. This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Or an alternative was a very long shot at television, because I wanted to go into television, and at that stage, at my age, I was very young, and television in those days was directed by a group of very senior people well into their 50s. The sort of Cecil B. DeMille of television at the time was a man called Rudolph Cartier. He did all the epics. Anyway, I got my way finally after many, many interviews to the idea of being interviewed for this possibility. And the final interview came, and I said to them, they said, look, we can offer you a pensionable job with radio, which at the end of it all would mean that you'll end up with a pension, or a 6-month trial without any future guarantees.
Gosh.
Television. Which do you choose? If we train you and then drop you if we want to at the end of 6 months? Well, I was shaking in my shoes because my father, who had financed my entire education, had already arranged for 2 very good jobs in India. One was in Burma Shell, which is an oil company, and the other was an advertising company, J. Walter Thompson's. So I had 2 very good job offers, and I was fighting it like mad. I said, give me 1 more year, I said to my dad. He said, well, I can't subsidize you beyond that. And it was within this year that I was really fighting to get my place. And thank God I finally got to, but there was a hitch, which I will share with you. They interviewed me finally and said, well, if we do give you the TV situation with no guarantees, we will drop our offer to do the pensionable job. And I said, okay. And so now I was hanging by my bootstraps. Then I got a notice to say, thank you for coming to see us. Unfortunately, we're not able to offer you the job, but we will shortlist you. If anybody falls through, you'll be the first person on our priority list. And I did not know what to tell my parents. And I hid the letter. And I don't know, I really lived through hell at that time. And then, you won't believe it, I actually went to audition for a small part because they saw my I put my photo in Spotlight, which is the actor's catalogue. And a director had seen it, and he thought I looked Middle Eastern enough to come and audition. And so when I went to see him, he said, we've got a small part of a radiographer in the desert, and in the Arab desert. He will be reporting on what's happening, and would you be happy to do it? And I said, oh, yes, absolutely, I said. They said, right. Well, I said, could you give me the script? Oh, no, you'd have to be improvising it.
Oh.
Well, I couldn't speak a word of Arabic. And I went home with my tail between my legs, having said yes. And they were offering me the wonderful salary of 75 quid. And I said to my mother, what the heck do I do now? And she said, oh my God, you better go upstairs. There's an Arab lady who lives upstairs. Ask her to write something down in Roman lettering, how to speak Arabic. And while I was in the middle of this muddle, on the Friday, before I started this one-man monologue in Arabic, I didn't know how I was going to deal with it. I got a phone call from the BBC. They said, somebody's dropped out from our trainee course. Can you start on Monday?
Oh, wonderful.
And I said, what about my contract with you to play? They said, oh, we'll take care of that, they said. And they did. And I turned up on the Monday, suit and tie with my little suitcase. And I joined the trainee class that time. Thank God for that particular breakthrough. The director who fell through was very well known, actually, but he decided to fall out at the last minute. So I always thank him now whenever I see him. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And I joined for 6 months, and thank God at the end of it, we all had to do a graduation exercise, and I chose a one-act play by Tennessee Williams, one act with 2 characters, set in the studio. I directed it the best way I could, and they took me on.
That is
that's my story.
That's wonderful. Did you feel a little more protected as a gay man and a man of colour working in a largely educated, creative environment like that? I mean, despite the time it was.
Well, interesting enough, being gay, that's something we should actually talk about. In those days, one did not discuss it at all, certainly not in the early 60s. However, and indeed not in my culture, I still lived at home. I respected my family very much, and it was very difficult for me because I was very confused about myself. I had not acknowledged my own sexuality totally at that time. I was actually making every attempt to date girls. In fact, I had a string, that sounds terribly arrogant to me. No, I was actually seeing one or two very beautiful girls on a platonic basis. I mean, I would go out with them, I would escort them, we'd be seen in public, and I was always very polite and saw them to their home and said good night and came home. So that was the degree of my attempt to be who I was not. So when it comes to the whole basic situation, I was totally hidden. I wasn't in torment as a lot of my colleagues were. And believe me, the BBC had its quota there, but not one of them acknowledged who they were or what they were about.
Sure.
I knew them by sight because I could sense certain things that were happening. And in those days, people haunted certain bathhouses.
Yep.
And in those days, one was possibly there in a very self-conscious way. And one or two film producers and television producers used to be. And we always averted our eyes from each other. We never said anything. We went back to our work at Television Centre and nobody said a thing.
Wow.
So that was the degree of my sexuality.
Yeah.
I didn't have any adventures. I didn't have any expressions of myself in that area. It took me a long time to realize that this is where I was heading. And gradually, through one reason or another, I decided I had to do something about it. Meanwhile, I was doing some very good work with the BBC. I was doing Play of the Month. I was doing the Wednesday play by writers like Simon Gray, Freddie Raphael, of course. So sex was sort of secondary.
Yeah.
But it emerged in one particular way because I met a very, very talented director. Sorry, not a director, a composer. And his music overwhelmed me. It was the music that overwhelmed me first. And then I realized this person was not only talented, but was very special. And I started seeing him. And that's what started that area of my life.
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely. What were you cutting your cloth on before Doctor Who arrived? And I think you did a spell on Compact, the BBC soap at the time. Compact
was basically what I was attached to it.
Oh, okay.
I had to follow other directors, basically, and didn't have much input, just to see how they worked. And in those days, Compact was a twice-weekly serial which went out. And don't forget, there was no opposition, basically. ITV had hardly started, and there was nothing like Compact. I don't think even Coronation Street had started then. So the entire British public depended on this twice-a-week series based in a woman's magazine about what happened to the people there.
Yes, all right, then. Here. Compact reception. Yes, madam, yes, it is on sale today.
And it was all done on a very tight budget. And one episode went out live. One was recorded, went out, one went out live. And it demanded a lot of skill from everybody, because, God, if anything went wrong...
Yes.
it showed on the screen.
Yeah.
Finally, I was given my first episode. And guess what happened? I was very careful how to plot everything, the moves and everything else that went with it. And don't forget, I was dealing with all these actors who, by the way, were entrenched in the public eye. I remember going in there and saying to an actress, "Oh, do you mind if I asked you to move from here to there and do this, that, and the other?" And she turned to me and said, "My character would never do that." So I had to then tell her, "Well, if you'd just like to move from the desk to the filing cabinet, I'd be very happy." And that's what happened. But anyway, I was directing her when all this went according to plan. I plotted the scenes with all my shots all planned out, and it was a live transmission. I'm sitting up in the control room. We'd rehearsed it all. It was all done in one day, by the way. And suddenly camera one, as we were in transmission, shook his head, but he's not on yet, but to say that he was about to fade out. And suddenly everything that was planned was now in jeopardy. And we were live. And I felt like that character that Doris Day played where she piloted a whole jumbo jet. She finally landed the plane because someone was telling her what to do. Well, no one was telling me what to do. I just sat there telling whatever cameras were available to take the shots that camera one had now faded out on, terrified that any minute now they would be facing each other and the actors, and the whole thing would end up in disaster. Well, as it happened, we managed to get through it without anything like that happening.
Amazing.
And at the end of it, I called the shots, the credits went up, and I collapsed in the control room. They took me off to the bar and gave me a very large gin and tonic.
I should think so too.
And I think that's what made me pass, actually.
Yes.
Once I passed that terrifying ordeal, I think they decided they were going to keep me on.
Yes. No, absolutely. Because I remember the pilot episode when we get to Doctor Who. That was fraught with troubles as well.
That was another one. Well, you see, I seem to be I seem to have been fated with testing times. The pilot for Doctor Who was another example of this. Bearing in mind we were working in one of the worst conditions ever given to us. We were working in Studio D in Lime Grove.
Lime Grove, as was.
It used to be a news studio where they did news reports from. Anyway, they gave us this really defunct place with huge camera equipments that, just were nothing to do with the very smart and glittering television centre, which we were sort of alienated from. So we had to create this science fiction drama from the depths of this terrible studio in Lime Grove.
Why won't you believe us? We just want you to tell us the truth.
You have heard the truth. We are not of this race. We are not of this earth. We are wanderers in the fourth dimensions of space and time, cut off from our own planet and our own people by eons and universes that are far beyond the reach of your most advanced sciences.
The pilot, as a result, was a disaster. Everything went wrong. And Sidney Newman, who started the whole thing off, took us out to dinner, Verity Lambert and myself, and said, by rights I should be firing both of you, but I'm going to give you another chance. Now, you have to understand, never in the history of the BBC had there ever been such a thing as a pilot episode. We didn't do things like that. They did that in America, but not here. So to get the chance to do it again was unbelievable. And the second time around, of course, we learned from our mistakes, and we all knew how to cope when things might potentially go wrong. I mean, we weren't given any extra facilities. We were still in Studio D. We weren't transferred to Television Centre, to those wonderful studios there. We were simply back to where we were, but we all knew how to deal with it. And the result is the very first episode of Doctor Who, which we're, of course, very proud of.
Yes, absolutely.
Have you ever thought what it's like to be wanderers in the fourth dimension? Have you? The exiles? Susan and I are cut off from our own planet, without friends or protection. But one day, we shall get back. Yes, one day. One day.
I get the impression, based on the docudrama from 2013, Mark Gatiss' brilliant venture in space and time,
yes.
You're almost like you were drafted into it. You weren't given an awful lot of choice.
Well, you know, it's, again, a very nice and funny story. They gave it to a very senior director there. As I told you, most of them were in their 40s and 50s. And they were doing sterling work, and I was the new boy on the block hanging around, doing compact and wondering where my future lay. And when this thing came up, this peculiar show called Doctor Who, which nobody at the BBC believed in apart from Sidney Newman, who created it, and Verity Lambert, who'd been brought in from ITV, again a female. Never before in the history of television had they found a female producer. So she was gossiped about, and so was I. I mean, can you think of two more extraordinary people to be assigned this kind of show, which in itself was extraordinary? You know, a British Asian and this very elegant lady, but there we were, and lumbered with this show. So we had to deal with it in the best way we could.
That must have been a very bonding experience for you and Verity.
Well, we became very good friends as a result of this.
Don't be fooled, Waris. That's all it is. Front. Inside, I'm shaking like a leaf.
I'm here by the skin of my bloody teeth. First Indian director this place has ever had.
So we've got to stick together, haven't we? Make our little show work. That'll teach them.
Who?
The old guard. This sea of fag smoke, tweed and sweaty men.
Listen, I overheard a couple of old horrors standing by the tier. They said, well, she didn't get hers standing up, did she?
Sydney's bit of fluff, am I?
Yeah, well, that seems to be the impression. And how else could you get a promotion like this?
A promotion like what? I'm trying to recreate the Stone Age with air-fixed glue and bloody baker foil.
We're trying to.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, here's to us.
The scripts weren't brilliant. They were all about creating fire in the Stone Age. I mean, how do you deal with people called Ugg and Og and grunting and try to make them convincing? We had to be careful that it just didn't become it could have been the butt of a lot of jokes and a lot of laughter and mockery. And if you actually look at it now, it's not. It actually works. And that was because I said to Verity, how are we going to do this? And she said, we're going to have to make it work. And we just took it very seriously. She said, look, let's just play this as if it's... and in fact, there was a film that came out very near there with Raquel Welch called 1 million years BC or something, Suddenly people were running around in skins. So we weren't too far off.
This is a strange creature.
Is son of the firemaker afraid of an old man? When will Tsar make fire come from his hands?
When Orb decides it.
Orb is for strong men. Orb has sent me this creature to make fire come from his fingers. I have seen it. Inside, he's full of fire. And the smoke comes from his mouth.
As lies come out of yours.
But I would say that, obviously the first episode is magic in its whole introduction to the series. But those other 3 episodes are very intense television. I caught them, I think, years later in the 5 Faces of Doctor Who. They did a series of repeats, and I'd never seen it before. And I was just, I was taken by the intensity of the situation, of the life or death situation, the fact they couldn't get back to the TARDIS, they were trapped, this feeling of being trapped, and I thought it was really, really effective. I mean, of course, the Daleks put Doctor Who on the map, but that was a good first story for me.
Yes, well, I'm glad you think so, because that was our attempt, and hopefully successfully, to get through what we had in our hands. I did not consider myself qualified at the start when I got the handful of scripts, thinking, my God, here am I, educated in Shakespeare,
yes,
and ended up directing people in skins saying ugh and og.
What was William Hartnell like to work with?
William was a very interesting character. He had been prominent in films, playing secondary but important roles. And he actually was very reluctant to take the role because he felt it was beneath him to do a television series. Mm. It was only after a lot of very expensive dinners on my behalf and Verity's, and also on Sidney Newman's, that he actually accepted it, thinking it would probably last a short time and it would put him on the map somehow, but no beyond that. Mm. He was the ultimate post-war, wartime Englishman, straight-backed, patriotic, saluted the flag, and when he suddenly got faced by a young Indian and a female, he didn't know what to do with it. And he was very self-defensive to start with, and I won't put it past him because he was that rigid sort of British attitude towards foreigners, and I had to deal with that. So anyway, apart from the fact that I spoke good English, I think that kind of impressed him. But the fact was that when we came to our first rehearsal, which was all in some hall in the middle of nowhere, we used to do these in various halls and with marked out floors with yellow tape, meant to be sets, of course, with props. And when we started rehearsals, I was planning on plotting the shots. And at one point I said, William, I'd like you to move here and then move over there. And he said, oh, I don't think about that. I think I'd like to move over here. And I said, oh, all right, William. Well, that's fine. You just move over where you want to. But I'll just tell you one thing. My camera won't be able to cover you on that. So all we'll do is we'll have you walk out a shot, then come back in if you like. And when he realised that
he didn't like that,
he said, oh, no, in that case, well, where will you be then? Where will I be? And then he, of course, went back to listening to what I was trying to do. And he listened. And the funny thing was, his initial truculence and reluctance to be a part of it, he actually not only took it on board, but we then evolved into a very good relationship. Through the time that I was on the show, because I did not only the first 4, but then I did the Marco Polo episodes, which have now got lost.
Is your name Marco Polo?
It is, my lady, and may I ask who you are?
Oh, we're travellers, yes. That's my grandchild, Susan, and that's Miss Wright, and that's Charlton.
Chesterton. Ian Chesterton. My companions are the Lady Pingcho and the Warlord Tegant. We travel to Shangtu.
Shangtu? That's in China, isn't it?
China? I do not know this place. Shangtu is in Cathay.
Oh, silly of me. Yes, of course, Cathay.
By that time, he and I had become very good friends, very respectful of each other. And when I was leaving, he was genuinely friendly and emotional in a way about my going, and I was too.
And did it feel like history was being made at the time, or did you not have the time to have any awareness of that? You were just trying to get on with making this show in the time allocated, etc., etc.
No, none of us thought none of us knew about the success of Doctor Who. Honestly, because the BBC had given it, I think, 6 months at the most. And it started off in a very rocky way, because, as you know, the first episode was going to be broadcast, and it happened to be on the same night that Kennedy was shot, and the killing and the assassination had a terrible effect on everybody. And I thought, well, that's the end of it. But then the BBC did hold on, and they repeated the first episode. But none of us knew that this show would continue right up till now. Of course, for me, it was a launching pad in order to be able to move on. And I ultimately ended up with the play for today, the Wednesday play, and the classics that we also did. These were shows that I was very privileged to be involved with. So Doctor Who was my jumping off show.
So as you rightly say, it wasn't just Doctor Who. You worked on so many wonderful productions, including many plays. Tell us about your memories of working on A Passage to India.
It was allocated to another director. This seems to be my fate most of the time. It was going to be done by another director. It was going to be an epic production, however, not to be shot in India. It was going to be shot in England, but the whole implication of this classic was it would be a very important production. I was very upset when I heard it was going to be done and I was not being considered for it. However, I was going to go to India for a holiday, and Peter Luke, the producer, said to me, while you're in India, it would be good enough to do some exterior shots for us, which we might be able to incorporate into the show.
Wonderful.
And I said, well, yes, if that's what you want me to do. And so I went off to India, and the BBC furnished me with a 16mm camera and a crew. In those days, it was all black and white anyway. So I had to guess, thinking, what would they need if I was doing it? So I took various establishing shots of exteriors and the law courts where I knew a scene was going to take place, and Fielding's house where I think I knew where he might want to live. And I took all these bits of film, basically. The train journey to the caves, I took that thinking, well, if I was doing this, I would use it for... In those days, we used to do back projection at Ealing Studios, so that you'd see it outside the windows of the railway carriage, if that was going to be used. I mean, I was guesswork all the way through. When I came back to England, I found that the director had fallen very seriously ill, and he was not going to be able to do it. Oh. And by this time, the production was already being put together, and of course, who would they possibly go to but me, because of my film extracts? So, apart from that, we had started off by adapting the novel per se, and we'd even got a writer standing by. And then Forster, who was still alive and living in King's College, Cambridge, said he did not want his novel dramatized. He did not give permission for that. What he had given permission for was the 4-act stage production, which had been performed in the West End. Well, that limited everything. I mean, we thought, well, we're doing the play, we're not doing the novel. And this was a huge disappointment because we couldn't choose the key moments from the novel. What I did do was to go to Cambridge and sit at his feet. He was still alive, and I'd graduated, but I knew he had a partiality, shall I say, for nice Indian gentlemen. And I put my hat on, full of charm, and I said, Mr. Forster, I said, looking at him with my innocent look, wouldn't you at least consider allowing some of us to put this into our production, because it's a 4-act play, very talky, and we're already going to have to make it visual, but wouldn't it be lovely if we could some of the scenes that are discussed and show them? For instance, a scene where Mrs. Moore meets Aziz at the mosque. Could I not shoot the mosque scene? And could I not shoot the arrival to the caves, which are very important, the journey to the caves and then the arrival? And he said, is that all you want to do? And I said, well, that would be sufficient if you would allow me to do that. And he said, well, in that case, I agree. So I was then able to go out, and we filmed the mosque exteriors at the Woking Mosque Woking at night, and then the interior at Ealing Studios, where Mrs. Moore and Aziz have their conversation. And then we did the railway carriage sequence with the backdrop that I'd used, the back projection in the railway carriage. So and their approach to the actual caves, which we shot, of all things, at a location we found had been used in Black Narcissus years ago, simulating the Himalayas. And I managed to find the last living person who'd worked on Black Narcissus, who told me that it was Toad Rock, Tunbridge Wells. So off we went to Tunbridge Wells, which, if you look at it from a certain angle, looks quite impressive, but is surrounded at the base by a lot of suburban houses. So I had my actors climbing up Toad Rock, and then they ended up in the studio caves that we built at the television centre. That was how I was able to open up whatever I could with my limited resources for Passage to India, of which I might say I'm extremely proud, because I got the most wonderful cast. I had Cyril Cusack as Fielding, and he was just brilliant. He could have been a sort of personification of Forster. I had Sybil Thorndike, Dame Sybil Thorndike, I could only call her Dame Sybil, playing Mrs. Moore, and Virginia McKenna playing Adela Quested, and Zia Mohyeddin, who played it originally on Broadway, and in the West End he played Aziz. So I was very, very fortunate in my casting.
And she wants to understand a little about India too.
Oh, who understands India? Not the Indians, at least.
Dr. Aziz, I wonder if you would be able to explain a disappointment we had this morning. Well, of course, it may be some form of Indian etiquette.
Oh, no. There is no question of etiquette. We are by nature a most informal people. May I know the facts?
Well, an Indian couple had invited us to call them and were to send their carriage for us. We waited and waited and waited. It never came.
I think they were ashamed of their house, and that is why they did not send.
Ah, yes, now that's quite possible, you know.
I do so hate mysteries.
How very English of you, Miss Crested.
Oh, I dislike them not because I'm English, but from a personal point of view.
Well, I rather like mysteries, but I do dislike muddles.
Tell us about your first major film project in 1969, A Touch of Love, which was entered into the 19th Berlin International Film Festival. That involved a number of your Cambridge contemporaries, didn't it, including Margaret Drabble, who wrote it, and also Ian McKellen in his first film.
Yes. Maggie wrote a book called The Millstone, which was made into a film, scripted by her. It's the only time Maggie Drabble actually wrote a script from her own novel. And for a first-time screenwriter, I can tell you, it was amazing. The script that was offered to us hardly had any changes to be made, and I was privileged enough to direct that. It was as a result of my television work, where the producers had seen my work. And this was, by the way, their first entry into the sort of serious literary world of filming, as opposed to... They used to make basically horror films. There were two Americans living here, and their films were always House of the Drip Blood kind of title. But they were following very much in a sort of minor key to Hammer horror films.
Okay.
But they decided to invest in this one project, and it was Maggie's novel. It was written it was about a single mother at a time when women were not supposed to be single mothers, in the early 60s. And it was about an intellectual. There were single mothers, of course, because Ken Loach did one about Cathy Come Home.
Yes, of course.
But that was about working class conditions in social conditions that weren't what Maggie was writing about. It was an upper middle class intellectual story. But of course, that's as relevant to anybody else in that social strata.
Yeah.
And I knew, again, that kind of world. And it was a privilege to direct it with Ian McKellen in his very first movie
Yes.
role.
Oh, George, this is Rosamond Stacey.
Hello. Haven't I seen you before, Summer? You don't work here?
Good Lord, no. She virtually lives in the British Museum. An academic, Rosamond. Oh, really?
Yes, really. You're a real announcer, I believe. What do you announce?
Oh, come off it, Ros. You must have seen him. He's hardly ever off the bloody box. He reads the news practically 365 days in the year.
It's very interesting. Must be very interesting. I mean, it must keep you very well informed.
Oh, I don't know about that. I know very little about a lot of things.
I remember asking him to do this. He actually was reluctant. He said, "Oh, no, Waris, I'm a theatre director, a theatre actor."
Yeah.
So I had to persuade him to play this part, and he finally agreed. And I can say with some pride that I was the first director in his now very eminent film life.
Yes, it was his first film. I think he'd done a TV version of David Copperfield before, but he was pretty well new to the whole world, wasn't he?
Yes, exactly.
And Eleanor Brom was in that one as well, wasn't she?
Eleanor, well, yes, of course, Eleanor. But Eleanor was my contemporary at Cambridge too. I acted with her in a couple of Tennessee Williams short plays. And she was a wonderful friend, and she still is. And when I was casting the film, I tried to fall back on all my Cambridge acquaintances. In fact, some of them are in lesser roles in the film. My good friend Roger Hammond played a small part. But when I had to find a best friend for the heroine, which, by the way, is played by Sandy Dennis, an American actress, and that's another story as to how she came to it. Without her, we wouldn't have been able to finance the film. But I had to find a best friend part, and who would play it, and I asked Eleanor to do it, and of course she did a sterling job. She actually balanced Sandy's participation, because Sandy had to really be careful how she spoke. This was such an upper middle class Fabian socialist character that you couldn't get it wrong, and she had a speech coach with her, but I had to keep constantly reminding her that she couldn't say something in a particular way, or how she phrased her delivery, because she was very well known in America for her quirky acting as a rather very all-American actress. She'd just been nominated for her part as Honey in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with the Burtons. So anyway, I'm very proud of having achieved that via Sandy and Eleanor and Ian.
You're listening to Waris Hussein on SNS Online. Plenty more coming up in part 2, including...
We also emptied out a whole set of hotels in Bath for the Burton Taylor entourage. I now realise that we could never have shot on 4 cameras, because to light Elizabeth alone took a very long time when you're a diva of her weight. While we were shooting, the rumour got out that one of the papers were going to publish a headline, "Gay director's lover dying while he directs AIDS drama." It was the classic New York set at Warner Brothers, which has been used multiple times in films, and I was there sitting on this incredible contraption saying, "I'm back, I'm in Hollywood," I said.
Part 2 of our extended interview with Waris Hussein, available now.